They sold my house while I was unconscious. My name is Emma Carter, I'm 31 years old, and 3 days ago I woke up in a hospital bed with a plastic wristband and 4 in my arm, and a message on my phone that didn't feel real. It wasn't the pain that hit me first. It was that text. The property has been transferred. It's done. I remember staring at the screen, my vision still blurry from anesthesia, trying to understand how a sentence like that could exist in my life. I didn't know it then, but 72 hours later, the same people who sent that message would be sitting across from a lawyer, unable to explain a single thing they had done. But to understand how it got there, you need to understand what my family had always been like. Growing up in our house in suburban Ohio, love wasn't something you felt equally. It was something that got assigned. My older brother, Daniel, got the center of everything. His achievements were celebrated, his mistakes were explained away, and his needs always came first. I learned early to take up less space. I learned to be easy. My mom used to say that word a lot. Emma's easy. She doesn't need much. At first, I thought it was a compliment. It took me years to realize it was an excuse. When I turned 18, my parents co-signed Daniel's lease on a downtown apartment. When I turned 18, I got a used laptop and a reminder that I should start thinking about practical decisions. When Daniel switched majors twice and added another year to his college tuition, my dad called it an investment. When I asked for help covering my final semester, my mom said, "You're strong, you'll figure it out." And I did. I always did. By 26, I had built something on my own. Not flashy. Not dramatic. But solid. I worked 2 jobs, saved aggressively, skipped vacations, and put every extra dollar into something that felt like proof I existed beyond their version of me. A small 2-bedroom house just outside Columbus. Purchase price, $412,000. Down payment, every dollar I had saved over 8 years. No help. No gifts. No shared ownership. Just my name on the paperwork. I remember sitting in that closing office, holding the pen, my hands slightly shaking as I signed. The attorney looked at me and said, "Make sure you keep your original deed in a safe place. That document is everything." I nodded like I understood. At the time, it just felt like paperwork. I didn't know how right he was. The first time my parents visited the house, my mom walked through the living room slowly, her eyes scanning everything like she was evaluating it. "It's nice," she said, but there was something in her tone that didn't match the words. My dad ran his hand along the kitchen counter and asked, "How much did this set you back?" When I told him, he let out a low whistle. "That's a lot for someone in your position." Someone in your position. I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew. Over the next year, the comments got sharper. Not loud. Not explosive. Just constant. "You should have consulted us. Family property should stay in the family. Daniel could have used a place like this." It was never said directly, but the message was always there. What's yours should somehow be ours. The last dinner before everything happened is something I replay a lot now. It was a Sunday. I had driven over to their house, brought takeout, tried to keep things normal. Halfway through the meal, my dad put his fork down and looked at me in that calm, controlled way he used when he was about to say something final. "You need to think long-term, Emma," he said. "Assets like that shouldn't sit with just one person. That's not how families operate." I remember feeling my chest tighten slightly. "It's in my name," I said carefully. "I worked for it." My mom sighed, like I had said something disappointing but expected. "We're not saying you didn't work for it," she said. "We're saying you don't understand how things work yet." Daniel didn't say anything. He never did in moments like that. He just kept eating, like this had nothing to do with him. I went home that night with a strange feeling I couldn't fully explain. Not fear. Not yet. Just a quiet awareness that something wasn't settled. 2 weeks later, I was in the emergency room. It wasn't dramatic. No accident. No chaos. Just a sudden, sharp pain that didn't go away, followed by a doctor telling me I needed surgery within the hour. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We need your consent now." I remember sitting there on that narrow hospital bed, signing forms I barely read, my mind trying to keep up with everything happening. I had exactly 7 minutes between being told I needed surgery and being wheeled down the hallway. 7 minutes to call someone. I called my mom. She didn't pick up. I sent a text instead. "I'm going into surgery. Can you check on the house later?" It was a simple request. Basic. Reasonable. I didn't know that text would become the reason they justified everything that came after. I remember the ceiling lights passing over me as they rolled me into the operating room. I remember thinking, oddly, about whether I had locked the front door. And then everything went quiet. When I woke up, the room was different. Dimmer. Slower. My throat was dry, my body heavy, my thoughts coming in fragments. The first thing I reached for was my phone. There were no missed calls. No voicemails. Just one message. Sent 2 hours earlier. From my father. "The property has been transferred. It's done." I read it once. Then again. The words didn't change. My heart didn't race. I didn't panic. Not yet. There was just this strange, hollow space where understanding should have been. Transferred. Done. I didn't know what they had done. I didn't know how far they had gone. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. They believed I wouldn't be able to stop them. And that was the first real mistake they made. I stared at that message for a long time, longer than I probably should have, because my brain kept trying to make it mean something smaller than what it clearly was, like maybe he meant paperwork or some kind of temporary arrangement, something reversible, something that did not involve my house being taken out from under me while I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed. But the more I read it, the more the words settled into place and refused to change, and that hollow feeling inside me started to sharpen into something else, something quieter but much more focused, and I remember thinking very clearly, they would not have sent that message unless they believed it was already finished, unless they believed there was nothing I could do about it. And that was when I opened my messages and scrolled up, looking for anything I had missed, anything that explained how they had gone from me asking them to check on the house to whatever this was. And there it was, a series of texts from my mother sent about an hour after I had been taken into surgery. "We spoke to someone about the property," followed by, "You should have told us you were overwhelmed," and then, "We are handling it for you. Do not worry," and even through the lingering haze of medication I could feel something cold settle into my chest because I knew that tone. I had heard it my entire life, that calm certainty that they were right, that they knew better, that whatever they decided automatically became the correct version of reality. And I also knew something else: they had not asked, they had not waited, they had not even tried to confirm anything with me before moving forward, they had decided. And that had been enough for them, and I remember shifting slightly in the hospital bed, wincing as the movement pulled at something deep inside me, and reaching for the call button, not because I needed a nurse, but because I needed a minute to sit up, to think clearly, to get out of that fog where everything felt distant and unreal. And as the room slowly came into focus, I opened my email, because there was one person I needed to hear from before I reacted to anything, and his name was still saved exactly the way it had been the day I bought the house: Michael Turner, real estate attorney, and I had not spoken to him in over a year, not since the closing, but I still remembered his voice, steady, precise, the kind of person who chose his words carefully and never wasted them, and I typed out a message with shaking fingers, not dramatic, not emotional, just facts. "Hi Michael, this is Emma Carter. You handled my property purchase in Columbus last year. I am currently in the hospital after emergency surgery, and just received a message from my parents stating that my property has been transferred without my authorization. I need to understand if this is even possible, and what steps I should take immediately." And I hit send before I could overthink it, because overthinking had never helped me with them, and then I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting, and that waiting felt familiar too, that same old pattern of being the one who had to figure things out alone, the one who had to clean up situations I did not create, the one who had to stay calm while everything around me shifted without warning, and I realized something in that moment that I had never fully said out loud before: this was not new. Not really, this was just the most extreme version of something they had been doing my entire life, deciding what was mine, deciding what I deserved, deciding how much of me they were allowed to take without asking, and I had always adjusted, always adapted, always found a way to move forward without confronting it directly, but this time was different. This time there was a number attached to it, a structure, a legal reality that did not change based on opinion or family dynamics. And that mattered because for the first time, this was not about feelings or expectations, it was about ownership, and ownership did not bend the same way people did. And about 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed again, and I saw his name appear on the screen, and my heart did not race, it did not spike with panic, it just slowed, like everything inside me was narrowing down to one point, one answer, and I opened the message, and it was short, just 2 sentences. Emma, no one can legally transfer your property without your signed authorization, or a valid power of attorney. If what you are saying is accurate, this transaction is not valid. And I read it once, then again, letting each word settle into place, and something inside me shifted completely, not relief, not yet, but clarity, the kind that cuts clean through confusion and leaves something solid behind it, because that meant one thing: they had acted without the one thing they needed, and they had done it confidently enough to tell me it was already finished, and that confidence was going to be the reason everything unraveled for them. And I leaned back against the hospital pillow, my hand still holding the phone, and for the first time since I woke up, I was not trying to understand what had happened, I was thinking about what they had overlooked, and more importantly, what they had never even known existed in the first place. That was the moment everything stopped feeling like chaos and started feeling like a sequence, like pieces that had already been set in motion long before I ever stepped into that hospital. And I remember closing my eyes for a second and replaying every conversation I had had with them over the past year, every comment about the house, every question about paperwork, every time they asked where I kept documents, and I brushed it off because I did not think it mattered, and now it did, because suddenly all of those moments lined up in a way that felt intentional instead of casual, and I realized something I should have realized earlier: they had been thinking about this for a while, not just reacting to an opportunity, but preparing for one. And that thought did not make me angry, it made me very still, because anger would have pushed me to react, and reacting was exactly what they expected. They expected confusion, maybe panic, maybe even a phone call where I demanded answers, but I did not give them any of that. Instead, I went back to Michael's message and read it again, focusing on the exact wording: no one can legally transfer your property without your signed authorization or a valid power of attorney. And I knew immediately that I had never given them either. I had never signed anything that gave them control, not even temporarily, and I had never added their names to any document connected to that house, which meant whatever they had done, it was built on something incomplete, something they assumed would be enough, and assumptions were fragile when they met actual documentation. And that was when another memory surfaced, something small at the time, but now suddenly very clear: the day of closing, sitting across from Michael in that office while he organized the final stack of documents. He had separated one paper from the rest and placed it in a folder that was different from everything else, heavier, more formal, and he had looked at me directly when he handed it over and said, "This stays with you, not in a shared folder, not with family, not in a place anyone else can access easily." And I had asked him why, and he said, "Because this is the only thing that proves ownership in a way that cannot be casually disputed." And at the time I nodded, thanked him, and put it in a safe place without thinking twice about it. But now, lying in that hospital bed, that moment came back with a clarity that felt almost sharp, because that document, the original deed, had never left my control, not once, not even when my parents visited, not even when they asked about my paperwork. I had never shown it to them, never copied it, never stored it anywhere they could reach. And I remember opening my phone again and scrolling through my notes, not because I did not know where it was, but because I wanted to confirm it, to ground myself in something real. And there it was, a simple entry I had made over a year ago: deed stored in safety deposit box, First National Bank, downtown branch. And seeing that line did something immediate to my entire body. It was like everything that had felt uncertain suddenly had edges again. Because that meant one thing very clearly: whatever they had used to transfer my property, it was not the original, it could not have been, and that meant the transaction they believed was complete was built on something that would not hold up the moment it was examined closely, and I did not smile. I did not feel satisfaction, not yet, but I did feel something settle into place, something controlled and steady, and I knew exactly what my next step needed to be, not calling them, not confronting them, but documenting everything. So I opened a new email to Michael and added more details, the timing of the message, the wording they used, the fact that I was under anesthesia during the supposed transfer, and I asked him one specific question: what is the fastest way to freeze or challenge this transaction before it progresses further, because speed mattered now, not for me, but for whoever they had involved on the other side of this deal, and within minutes, his response came through, more detailed this time, outlining steps, advising immediate contact with the title company, recommending that no further communication be made directly with my parents until everything was reviewed, and as I read through it, I realized something else. This was no longer a private situation. This was going to involve other people, professionals, records, timelines, and that changed the entire dynamic, because my parents had always operated in spaces where their version of events could go unchallenged, where tone and confidence carried more weight than facts. But this was different. This was a system that required proof, and proof was the one thing they did not actually have. And I set my phone down for a moment, looking up at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the hospital room. And I thought about the message my father had sent, how final it sounded, how certain he seemed, and I wondered if he still felt that way, or if somewhere in the back of his mind there was a small doubt, something telling him that this might not unfold the way he expected, because I knew something he did not, something he had never even considered, and that was the difference between what they believed they owned and what they could actually prove. And that difference was about to become very visible. The next morning, the hospital room felt different, not quieter, not calmer, just more defined, like everything that had been uncertain the day before had settled into a shape I could actually move around in, and I remember checking my phone before I even fully sat up, half expecting another message from my parents, something defensive or controlling, but there was nothing, just silence. And that silence told me more than anything they could have said, because it meant they believed the situation was finished. They were not checking in, they were not explaining, they were not even trying to manage my reaction. They had already moved past it in their minds, and that kind of confidence only comes from thinking you have already won. And I let that sit for a moment before opening my email again, where Michael had sent a longer response overnight, outlining exactly what he had already started doing on my behalf. He had contacted the county recorder's office to flag any recent filings tied to my property. He had reached out to the title company listed in the preliminary records, and he had requested an immediate hold on any further processing related to the transaction until ownership could be verified. And as I read through each step, I realized how quickly this had shifted from something private to something procedural, something that now existed in a system where every action left a trace, every document could be examined, and every assumption could be challenged. And that was when my phone buzzed again, not a message this time, but a call, and the name that appeared on the screen was unfamiliar, just a number with a Columbus area code, and I hesitated for a second before answering, because I already had a feeling about who it might be. And when I picked up, the voice on the other end confirmed it almost immediately. "Hi, is this Emma Carter?" The tone was professional, measured, the kind of voice that came from someone used to navigating complicated situations carefully. "This is Mark Reynolds. I am calling regarding the property on Ridgeview Drive," and I did not interrupt him. I just listened, because the way he said it told me everything I needed to know. He was not calling to confirm a routine detail. He was calling because something did not add up. "We are currently in the process of reviewing a transfer that was initiated yesterday," he continued, "and there are a few discrepancies we need to clarify before proceeding." And I could almost see the situation from his side now, a transaction that looked complete on the surface but had just enough inconsistencies to trigger concern. And I asked him one simple question, keeping my voice as steady as his: "What kind of discrepancies?" And there was a brief pause before he answered, like he was choosing his words carefully. "The documentation we received does not fully align with the ownership records on file, and we have been advised to pause until we can confirm authorization directly with you." And there it was, the first visible crack, not in my world but in theirs, because this meant the process they believed was finished had already started to slow down, already started to question itself. And I told him exactly what he needed to hear, nothing more, nothing less. I did not authorize any transfer of that property. I have not signed any documents related to a sale, and I was in surgery at the time this was initiated. And the silence on the other end of the line shifted slightly after that, not uncomfortable, just heavier, like the weight of what I had said was settling into place. And He responded immediately, more direct now. Understood. We will maintain the hold on the transaction and escalate this for further review. And that was it. No drama, no raised voices, just a process adjusting itself in real time based on one piece of truth. And when the call ended, I set my phone down and let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. Because this was the first moment where something outside of me had acknowledged what was happening, where someone not connected to my family, not influenced by their expectations or their narrative, had heard the situation and responded to it based on facts alone, and that mattered more than anything they could say, because it meant this was no longer something they could control through confidence or assumption. It was something that would be examined step by step, and I knew exactly how they would react when they realized that, because I had seen it before, not in something this serious, but in smaller situations, moments, where their version of events was challenged by something they could not dismiss, and it always followed the same pattern: first disbelief, then irritation, then a sudden shift into justification, explanations that tried to reframe what they had done as reasonable, necessary, even helpful, and I could already hear my mother's voice in my head, calm and certain, saying something like, "We were trying to take care of things for you," or my father's tone, more direct, "You would not have been able to handle it in your condition," and maybe a part of me would have reacted to that before. Maybe I would have tried to explain myself, to prove that I was capable, that I understood what I was doing. But now, sitting there in that hospital room, with a transaction already on hold and professionals already involved, I realized something that made all of that unnecessary. I did not need them to understand. I did not need them to agree, and I definitely did not need them to admit anything, because this was no longer a conversation, it was a process, and processes do not respond to explanations, they respond to evidence. And the one thing I had that they did not was something they had never even asked about, something they had never thought to question. And as I looked at my phone again, I knew it was only a matter of time before they realized that too. It did not take long for that realization to reach them, and when it did, it came exactly the way I expected, not through silence, not through reflection, but through control, because about an hour after that call ended, my phone lit up again, this time with my mother's name, and for a second I just looked at it, watching it ring, thinking about all the times in my life when I had answered immediately, when I had adjusted my tone, softened my words, tried to keep things calm before they even had a chance to escalate, and this time I did none of that. I let it ring twice more before I picked up, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be very clear about one thing. I was not reacting. I was choosing when to engage, and the moment I answered, she started speaking, no greeting, no pause, just straight into it. "Emma, what is going on with the property?" Her voice carried that familiar mix of urgency and control, like she expected confusion on my end, like she assumed I had just found out and was scrambling to understand, and I could hear something else underneath it too, something tighter, something that had not been there before, and I said nothing for a second, just enough time for her to continue. "We are getting calls from the title company. They are saying the transfer is on hold, they are asking questions that do not make sense," and there it was, the shift, not complete yet, but starting, because the system had pushed back, and now they were trying to figure out why. And I finally spoke, keeping my voice level, the same way I had spoken to Mark, that is because I did not authorize any sale, and the silence on the other end of the line was immediate, not long, just enough to register, and then she responded, faster now, sharper, "Emma, do not do this, we stepped in because you were in the hospital, you were not in a position to manage something like this." And I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of frustration, but because I recognized the pattern unfolding exactly as expected, first justification, then reframing, turning what they had done into something reasonable, even necessary, and I let her finish before responding, because timing mattered more than volume. "You did not have permission," I said, simply, and she exhaled in that controlled way she always did when she was about to push harder. "We are your parents. We do not need formal permission to handle family matters," and that sentence would have worked on me before. It would have pulled me into an argument about respect, about boundaries, about what family meant, but now it sounded different. Now it sounded irrelevant, because none of those things applied to what was happening, and I answered her with something she was not expecting, not emotional, not defensive, just factual. "The transaction has been flagged and is under review. You should speak to your own legal counsel." And there was another pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, the tone had changed slightly, less certain, more probing. "Emma, what did you tell them?" And I could hear it clearly now, the first real sign that she understood this was not something she could control through conversation alone, and I did not give her anything more than what she had already heard. "The truth," I said, and for the first time since the call started, She did not respond immediately, and in that silence I could almost feel her recalculating, shifting from assumption to strategy, and then my father's voice came through in the background, not directly to me, but loud enough that I could hear it, ask her about the documents, and that was the moment everything aligned completely, because that question, that single word, documents, told me exactly what they were starting to realize, not fully yet, but enough to be concerned, enough to question whether what they had used was actually sufficient, and my mother came back on the line, her voice more controlled now, more careful. Emma, what paperwork do you have related to the house? And I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed what I already knew. They did not know, they had moved forward without understanding the one thing that mattered most, and I answered her the same way I had answered everything else, steady, direct, everything that proves ownership, and that was all I gave her, no details, no explanations, just enough to let the weight of that statement settle in, and this time the silence that followed was different. It was not confusion, it was not irritation, it was something closer to realization, and I knew that feeling well, because I had experienced it myself just a day earlier, that moment when you understand that the situation is not what you thought it was, that something fundamental has been overlooked, and that whatever comes next is not going to follow the path you expected. And my father's voice came through again, closer this time, more direct. Emma, we need to talk about this in person, and I let a second pass before answering, not to delay, but to make sure my response landed exactly the way I intended. No, I said calmly, you need to talk to the people handling the transaction, and I ended the call before they could respond, not out of anger, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing else to say, not anymore. Because this was no longer a discussion between us, it was something else entirely, something structured. Something documented, something that would move forward whether they were ready for it or not, and as I set my phone down again, I realized that the balance had already shifted, not in a dramatic way, not with a confrontation or a final statement, but quietly, through process and proof, and they were just starting to feel it. The silence after that call did not last long, but it changed everything about how the next few hours unfolded, because this time, when my phone rang again, it was not my mother, and it was not my father, it was Daniel, and that alone told me that whatever conversation they were having on their side had already shifted into something more urgent, something they were trying to manage from multiple angles, and I let it ring once before answering, not because I was hesitating, but because I already knew this would be different. Daniel did not lead with control the way they did, he led with familiarity, with the kind of tone that tried to lower defenses before asking for something, and when I picked up, that is exactly what I heard. Hey, Em, he said, softer than usual, almost careful, what is going on? Mom and Dad are saying the deal is stuck, and I leaned back slightly against the hospital pillow, letting his words settle, because even in that sentence, there was an assumption built in, the deal is stuck, not the deal is invalid, not something went wrong, just stuck, like it was a temporary delay, something that could be pushed forward again if the right pressure was applied, and I responded the same way I had been responding to everything else, with clarity instead of emotion. It is not stuck, Daniel, it is being reviewed. And there was a small pause on his end, just long enough for him to register the difference, and then he shifted. Okay, but why would it be under review if everything was already signed? And that question might have worked before, it might have pulled me into explaining the situation in detail, but now it sounded incomplete, because it was based on information he did not actually have, and I said, because everything was not signed, and the silence that followed was heavier this time, not confused, not defensive, just processing, and I could almost hear him thinking through it, trying to reconcile what he had been told with what I was saying, and then he asked the question they had all been circling around without fully understanding, what are they missing? And that was the moment I realized something important about Daniel. He was not trying to control the situation, he was trying to understand it, and that made him different, not innocent, not uninvolved, but different, and I chose my words carefully, not to protect him, but to keep the focus exactly where it needed to be. They do not have what proves ownership, I said, and he did not respond immediately, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not completely, but enough to show that something had clicked. You mean the deed, he said, and I did not confirm it directly. I did not need to. The fact that he knew the word meant he understood the implication, and I let that sit for a second before adding, the original. And that was all it took, because there is a difference between knowing a term and understanding its weight, and I could hear that difference in the way he exhaled, slow, controlled, like he had just realized that what they thought was a completed transaction was actually missing the one thing that made it real, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and in that silence I thought back to all the times Daniel had been in the room when decisions were made, when I was told to adjust, to accept, to move on, and he had stayed quiet, not because he did not notice, but because it never affected him directly, and now it did, because he was part of something that was starting to unravel, and when he spoke again, his tone was different, not persuasive, not dismissive, just direct. They did not think that mattered, he said, almost to himself, and I answered without hesitation, it is the only thing that matters. And there was another pause, longer this time, and I could tell he was weighing something, not just the situation, but his position in it, and then he said something I did not expect, not because it was surprising, but because it was the first time I had heard it from him. They should not have done this without talking to you. And I did not respond right away, because that statement, simple as it was, carried a shift that had never existed in our dynamic before. It acknowledged that there was a line, and that it had been crossed, and I said, quietly, they did not think they needed to, and that was the truth, the same truth that had shaped everything leading up to this, and he did not argue with it, he did not try to defend them, he just let it sit there, and then he asked one more question. The kind that comes when someone realizes the situation is bigger than they thought. What happens now? And I looked down at my phone for a second before answering, because the answer was no longer something I had to guess, it was already in motion. Now it goes through the process, I said, and the process is going to show exactly what they did not have, and I could hear it in the silence that followed, not fear, not panic, but recognition, the kind that comes when you understand that something is no longer in your control. And as the call ended, I set my phone down again, feeling that same steady clarity settle in, because every conversation, every call, every pause was pointing in the same direction. They were starting to understand the gap between what they believed and what could actually be proven, and that gap was about to become impossible to ignore. By the time the afternoon settled in, the situation had moved beyond conversations and into something much more structured, something that did not depend on tone or persuasion, and I could feel that shift not just in the calls I was receiving, but in the absence of them too, because after my conversation with Daniel, there was a stretch of time where my phone stayed completely silent, no messages from my mother, no follow-up from my father, and that silence was not calm, it was strategic. It was the kind of silence that happens when people step back to reassess what they are dealing with, and I knew exactly what that meant. They were talking to someone, probably a lawyer, probably the same person who had helped them move forward with the transaction in the first place, and they were trying to understand why something that seemed finished was now being questioned, and more importantly, what could be done to fix it. And I did not have to guess how that conversation was going, because about an hour later, my phone buzzed again with a new message, not from my parents this time, but from an unknown number, and when I opened it, the tone was immediately clear, professional, controlled, and carefully worded. Ms. Carter, this is Jonathan Hale, legal counsel representing Robert and Linda Carter regarding the recent property transfer. We would like to request a conversation to clarify certain details and resolve any misunderstandings. And I read it once, then again, paying attention not just to what it said, but to what it avoided saying. There was no mention of authorization, no mention of ownership, just misunderstandings, as if the entire situation could be reframed as a simple miscommunication instead of what it actually was, and that told me everything I needed to know about their current position. They were not denying anything yet, they were trying to soften it, to bring it back into a space where it could be negotiated instead of examined, and I did not respond immediately, not because I did not know what to say, but because timing mattered, and I wanted to be sure that whatever response I gave aligned with the process already in motion. So instead of replying, I forwarded the message directly to Michael with a simple note, they have retained counsel and are requesting contact, and within minutes, his reply came through, short and precise, do not engage directly, all communication should go through me from this point forward, and I followed that exactly, because this was no longer something I needed to manage personally. It had already moved into a space where professionals were handling it based on documentation, not conversation. And about 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, the same unknown number, and I let it go to voicemail, not out of avoidance, but because that was the boundary now. And when the voicemail came through, I listened to it carefully, the same voice, the same measured tone, reiterating the request for a discussion, emphasizing the desire to resolve things efficiently, and I could hear something underneath it, not urgency exactly, but pressure. The kind that builds when a situation is not unfolding the way it was expected to, and I set the phone down. After listening, feeling that same steady clarity that had been building since I woke up, because every step they were taking was confirming the same thing. They did not have control over how this would end, they were trying to regain it, but the structure they were now inside did not allow for that kind of adjustment without proof, and proof was the one thing they could not create retroactively, and I thought about my mother's voice earlier, the certainty she had when she said they did not need permission, and how different that must sound now, sitting across from a legal professional who was asking questions that required actual answers, not assumptions, and I wondered if she was still as confident, or if she was starting to realize that the framework she relied on in our family did not extend into this space, and my phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification, and when I opened it, it was from Michael, confirming that he had already made contact with their counsel, that all further communication would be handled through proper channels, and that a formal review of the transaction was already underway, including verification of signatures, authorization records, and the absence of the original deed in any submitted documentation, and that last part mattered more than anything else, because it meant the one thing they had overlooked was now the central point of examination, the one detail everything else would be measured against, and I leaned back against the hospital pillow, letting that settle in, because this was no longer about what they claimed or what they intended, it was about what could be proven, and that distinction was going to define everything that happened next, and for the first time since this started, I was not thinking about what they had done. I was thinking about how it would look when someone else laid it out in front of them. Step by step, document by document, showing exactly where the process broke down, exactly where the assumption replaced authorization, and exactly where the absence of one specific piece of evidence made the entire transaction collapse, and I knew that moment was coming, not because I hoped for it, but because it was already being built, piece by piece, in a system that did not move based on belief, but on what could actually be verified, and they were now fully inside that system whether they were ready for it or not. The next day, everything moved faster, not in a chaotic way, but in a controlled, deliberate sequence that made it clear this was no longer a situation that could be quietly adjusted or explained away. And I could feel that shift the moment I woke up and checked my phone, because there was a new email waiting from Michael, time-stamped early that morning, and as I opened it, I already knew this was going to be different from the updates before. The tone was more formal, more structured, like something had crossed a threshold, and the first line confirmed it. The transaction has been formally challenged and is now under active investigation by the title company and county office, and I read that slowly, letting each word settle, because that meant this was no longer just a review, it was an examination, something that required documentation, timelines, verification, and accountability. And as I continued reading, the details became more specific. The signatures submitted with the transfer were being compared against verified records, the authorization was being traced back to its origin, and most importantly, there was no record of the original deed being presented or verified at any point in the transaction process, and that absence was not a minor issue, it was central, it was the kind of gap that stopped everything, and I sat there for a moment, holding my phone, feeling that same steady clarity deepen into something even more defined, because this was the moment where everything shifted from possibility to inevitability, not in terms of outcome but in terms of exposure, because once a process like this begins, it does not stop halfway, it continues until every inconsistency is addressed, and that meant there would be no version of events where this simply faded away or got quietly corrected. And about 30 minutes later, my phone rang again, this time from Michael directly, and I answered immediately, because I knew this call would matter. "Emma," he said, his voice as calm and precise as ever, "we have confirmation that the transfer cannot proceed in its current form," and I closed my eyes briefly, not out of relief, but to absorb the weight of what that meant, and he continued, "There are multiple issues, but the primary one is the absence of valid ownership documentation, specifically the original deed. Without that, the transaction has no legal standing," and I let that settle, because hearing it stated that clearly, from someone who dealt with these situations professionally, removed any remaining doubt, any lingering uncertainty about where this was heading, and I asked the only question that mattered at this point, "What happens next?" And his answer was immediate. "The transaction will be halted, and depending on the findings, there may be further action taken regarding how it was initiated," and he paused for a second before adding, "Their counsel has already reached out again requesting to resolve this before it escalates further," and I almost expected that, because this was the stage where control shifted completely, where the people who initiated the situation realized they were no longer directing it, and I asked, "Have you responded?" And he said, "Yes. I informed them that any resolution will be based on full disclosure of how the transfer was attempted and verification of all submitted documents, and that told me everything I needed to know, because full disclosure is not something you ask for unless you expect there to be something worth uncovering." And after the call ended, I sat there for a moment, looking out the window of the hospital room, watching the parking lot below, cars moving in and out, people going about their day, completely unaware of what was unfolding behind a set of documents and signatures, and I thought about my parents, about where they were at that exact moment, whether they were sitting across from their lawyer, hearing the same kind of language I had just heard, words like invalid, unauthorized, halted, and I wondered if they were still trying to frame it as a misunderstanding, or if they had reached the point where they understood that this was something else entirely, something that could not be reshaped by explanation. And my phone buzzed again, another message, this time from my mother, shorter than before, more direct. Emma, we need to resolve this today, and I looked at it for a moment, noticing what was missing. No justification, no explanation, no attempt to reframe what they had done, just a request, urgent and contained, and I understood what that meant. They were no longer trying to control the narrative. They were trying to limit the consequences, and I did not respond, not because I was ignoring her, but because there was nothing I needed to say, not anymore, because this had moved beyond anything I could influence directly, and as I set my phone down again, I realized something that felt almost strange in its simplicity. The outcome of this situation was no longer dependent on how strongly they believed they were right, it was dependent on what could be proven, and that difference, that single shift from belief to proof, was about to define everything that came next. By the afternoon, the situation had reached a point where everything that could be quietly managed had already been replaced by something much more visible, and I realized that not because of anything I said or did, but because of how the communication around me had changed, because now it was not just updates and confirmations, it was scheduling, coordination, people preparing to sit down and put everything on record, and that became clear when Michael called again, this time with a level of directness that meant there was no more delay left in the process. Emma, he said, they have agreed to a formal meeting with all parties present, including the title company representative, and I listened carefully, because that was a shift from negotiation to exposure, and he continued, this will take place tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., and I would strongly recommend your presence, even if it is remote. And I looked down at my hospital wristband for a second, the thin plastic still wrapped around my arm, and said, I will be there, because I understood exactly what that meeting represented. It was not about resolving confusion, it was about laying everything out in a space where nothing could be reframed or redirected, and after the call ended, I sat there for a moment, letting that reality settle in, because I knew what that room was going to look like. Not physically but structurally, a table, documents, professionals, each person there for a specific role, and in the middle of it, a transaction that did not hold up under scrutiny, and I thought about my parents walking into that room, carrying whatever version of the story they had been telling themselves, and how quickly that version would start to break down once it was placed next to actual records, and my phone buzzed again, another message from my mother, shorter than the last, more controlled, we will discuss everything tomorrow, and I noticed the difference immediately. No urgency this time, no demand for immediate resolution, just acknowledgement of what was coming, and that told me everything I needed to know. They had reached the point where they understood this was no longer something they could fix through conversation alone, and I did not respond, because there was nothing to add, not until everything was in front of the right people, and the rest of the day moved slowly after that, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered was already set in motion. And I spent that time going over details with Michael, reviewing timelines, confirming what documentation would be referenced, making sure there was no gap in the sequence of events, not because I doubted anything, but because precision mattered now. Every detail had to align, every step had to be clear, and as we went through it, the pattern became even more obvious, the timing of the transfer request, the absence of my authorization, the use of incomplete documentation, and most importantly, the complete lack of the original deed in anything they submitted. And that last point kept coming up, not as a minor oversight, but as the central issue, the one thing everything else would come back to. And I remember asking Michael one specific question. What happens when they realize that in the meeting, and he paused for a second before answering, not because he was unsure, but because he was choosing his words carefully, they already realize something is wrong, tomorrow they will understand exactly what, and that difference mattered, because there is a moment in situations like this where uncertainty becomes clarity, and clarity changes how people respond. And I knew that moment was coming, not just for them, but for everyone in that room, because once the absence of that one document was established, everything else would fall into place around it. And as the evening settled in, the hospital room grew quieter, the usual sounds fading into the background, and I found myself thinking back to the day I bought the house, to that small office, that final stack of papers, and the way Michael had separated that one document from the rest. And I remember thinking at the time that it felt overly formal, almost unnecessary, and now, It was the single most important detail in everything that was happening, and I realized something in that moment that I had not fully understood before. This was never about how confident they were or how certain they felt. It was about whether their version of events could survive being placed next to something that did not change, something that existed outside of opinion, and tomorrow, that comparison would finally happen. Not in private, not in conversation, but in a setting where every word, every document, and every gap would be seen for exactly what it was. And as I set my phone down for the night, I knew one thing with complete certainty: whatever they believed when they walked into that room, they were not going to walk out believing the same thing. The next morning arrived with a kind of clarity that did not feel dramatic, just precise, like everything had narrowed down to a single point that could no longer be avoided, and I was awake before the nurse even came in to check my vitals, already sitting upright in the hospital bed with my phone in my hand, waiting, not nervously, not impatiently, just aware that what was about to happen was not something that could be undone or softened once it started. And at exactly 9:52 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Michael: "The meeting will begin shortly. I will add you to the call." And I read it once, then placed the phone on the small tray table in front of me, adjusting it so the camera faced me directly, not because I cared how I looked, but because I wanted to be present in the room, even if it was through a screen. And a few minutes later, the call came through, and I answered immediately. The screen shifting from my reflection to a conference room I had never been in but immediately understood: a long table, neutral walls, folders neatly arranged in front of each seat, and four people already there: Michael on one side, composed and focused, across from him a man I recognized from the voicemail, Jonathan Hale, sitting straight with a stack of documents in front of him, next to him the title company representative, Mark Reynolds, flipping through a file, and at the far end of the table, my parents, seated side by side, my mother with her hands folded tightly in front of her, my father leaning slightly forward, his posture more rigid than usual, and for a moment no one spoke, not out of hesitation, but because everyone was waiting for the structure of the meeting to begin. And then Michael broke the silence, his voice steady and controlled: "Thank you all for being here. We are here to review the recent attempted transfer of the property located on Ridgeview Drive, and to clarify the discrepancies identified in the submitted documentation." And his tone set the framework immediately. This was not a discussion, it was a review, and everything that followed would be anchored in that. And he continued, outlining the timeline briefly: the initiation of the transfer, the submission of documents, the subsequent flag raised by the title company. And as he spoke, I watched my parents, not their words but their reactions. My mother's expression remained controlled, but there was tension in her shoulders that had not been there before. My father's gaze stayed fixed on the documents in front of him, as if looking up would somehow shift the direction of the conversation. And when Michael finished, Mark spoke next, his voice measured, professional: "During our review, we identified that the documentation provided did not include verifiable proof of ownership consistent with county records, specifically the absence of the original deed, and there it was, stated clearly, without emphasis, without accusation, just a fact." And I saw it happen in real time, the exact moment that word landed, deed, because both of my parents shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to register that something they had not fully accounted for was now central to the discussion. And Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but more engaged now. "We provided all relevant documentation that was available at the time," he said, and Michael responded immediately, not confrontational, just precise: "Available documentation is not sufficient in this case. The transfer of ownership requires specific verification that has not been met." And the conversation continued like that, each statement building on the last, each response narrowing the space for interpretation. And then Michael turned slightly toward the screen, toward me, and said, "Emma, can you confirm for the record whether you authorized any transfer of your property?" And I answered without hesitation, my voice steady, clear: "I did not authorize any transfer. I did not sign any documents related to a sale, and I was in surgery at the time this was initiated." And the room went quiet for a moment after that, not because what I said was unexpected, but because it was now on record, no longer implied, no longer assumed, just stated. And then Michael continued, "Additionally, the original deed remains in Ms. Carter's possession, and was never presented or verified during this transaction." And that was the point where everything shifted, not visibly, not in a dramatic reaction, but in the structure of the conversation itself, because from that moment on, there was no more discussion about intent or misunderstanding. Everything came back to that one fact, the absence of the original deed. And I watched as Jonathan adjusted his posture slightly, flipping through his documents again, as if looking for something that might change what had just been established, but There was nothing there, and my mother finally spoke, her voice controlled but tighter than before. We were acting in her best interest. She was not in a position to handle this, and for the first time, her words did not carry weight in the room, not because they were ignored but because they were not relevant to the process being followed, and Mark responded, not dismissively, just firmly. Intent does not override required authorization and documentation, and that was it. That was the moment where the framework they had relied on their entire lives stopped applying completely, because this was not about what they believed was right, it was about what could be proven, and there was nothing in front of them that could replace what was missing. And as the conversation continued, moving toward next steps, formal conclusions, and potential consequences, I realized something that felt almost quiet in its certainty: the outcome had already been decided the moment that document was not part of what they submitted. Everything happening now was just the process catching up to that fact, and as I sat there, watching it unfold in real time, I knew that whatever they had expected when they initiated this, it had never included this moment, this room, this structure, where everything they assumed would hold simply did not. The rest of the meeting unfolded with a kind of inevitability that no one in that room could ignore, because once the absence of the original deed had been established, every attempt to redirect the conversation lost its footing almost immediately, and I watched it happen step by step, not in raised voices or dramatic reactions, but in the way each response narrowed instead of expanded, in the way every explanation circled back to the same missing piece. And Jonathan tried again, his tone still composed but noticeably more careful now. If there is an issue with the documentation, we can work toward correcting that, and Michael responded without hesitation, his voice steady, almost neutral. This is not a matter of correction, this is a matter of authorization that did not exist at the time of the transaction, and that distinction settled into the room like something solid, something that could not be moved or adjusted. And I saw my father shift in his chair slightly, his hand tightening around the edge of the table for just a second before relaxing again, and my mother's posture became even more controlled, like she was holding everything in place through sheer discipline. But there was something else there now, something that had not been present before, not just tension, but recognition, the kind that comes when a situation is no longer abstract, when it becomes specific and unavoidable. And Mark spoke again, referencing the procedural side: without verified ownership documentation, specifically the original deed, the transfer cannot be processed. And any attempt to proceed without it raises significant compliance concerns, and that phrase, compliance concerns, carried weight in a way that family language never could, because it implied consequences that extended beyond this room, beyond this conversation. And I saw Jonathan glance briefly at my parents before responding, as if measuring how much needed to be said. Our intent was to facilitate a timely resolution given the circumstances, he said, and this time Michael did not respond. Immediately, he let that statement sit for a moment before answering. Intent does not replace legal authority, and the circumstances do not change the requirement for proper documentation. And that was the point where the conversation stopped trying to bridge gaps and started defining them clearly, and I could feel it, not emotionally, but structurally, like the room itself had shifted into a different phase, one where outcomes were no longer being negotiated, they were being determined. And my mother spoke again, her voice quieter now, but still controlled. What exactly are you saying happens now? And there was a brief pause before Mark answered, his tone direct and procedural. The transaction is considered invalid in its current form, it will not proceed, and all related filings will be halted pending further review. And that was it. That was the moment where everything they had assumed was complete was officially undone, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through a process that simply did not support what they had done. And I watched my father look down at the documents in front of him again, this time not as if searching for something, but as if acknowledging that what was there was not enough. And Jonathan added, carefully, we will need to assess next steps in light of this determination. And Michael responded, that would be advisable, and the tone of the room shifted again, not toward resolution but toward consequence, because once something is formally recognized as invalid, the focus moves to how it happened and what follows from that. And I realized then that this was no longer about the property alone, it was about the process that had been bypassed, the assumptions that had been made, and the documentation that had not been verified. And those things did not just disappear once identified, they stayed, they were recorded, they became part of the record moving forward. And I could see it in the way everyone at the table was now approaching the conversation, more deliberate, more precise, each word carrying weight because it would not just be heard, it would be documented. And I sat there quietly, listening, not needing to add anything further, because everything that needed to be said had already been established. And for the first time since this began, I was not thinking about what they had done, or why they had done it. I was thinking about how clearly it had been laid out in front of them, how every assumption had been replaced by a requirement, every justification by a standard, and how there was nothing left to reinterpret or reframe. And as the meeting moved toward its conclusion, with final statements, acknowledgments, and the formal closing of the discussion, I understood something that felt almost simple in its finality. The power in this situation had never come from confrontation, it had come from structure, from the fact that there were rules that did not change based on who you were or what you believed, and once those rules were applied, everything else fell away, leaving only what could actually be proven, and in that space, there was no version of events where what they had done could stand. When the meeting ended, it did not end with a final argument or a dramatic exchange, it ended the way processes like that always do, with confirmation, documentation, and a quiet acknowledgement that what had been presented could not be changed by anything further said in that room, and I watched as each person began to gather their materials, folders closing, papers being aligned, the structure dissolving not because the issue was unresolved, but because it had already been decided, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, not even my parents, and that silence felt different from the others that had come before it. This one was not about control or strategy, it was about acceptance, not emotional acceptance, but structural acceptance, the understanding that what had just been outlined was now part of an official record, something that would not shift based on reaction or explanation. And Michael turned slightly toward the screen, his voice calm as always. "Emma, we will follow up with a written summary of everything discussed today, including the formal determination regarding the invalid transfer," and I nodded. Not because he needed confirmation, but because it felt like the natural close to something that had been building since the moment I woke up in that hospital bed, and as the call disconnected, the screen went dark, leaving only my reflection for a second before the room came back into focus around me, and I sat there quietly, not overwhelmed, not relieved, just still, because everything that had happened over the past few days had led to this point, and now that it was here, it felt almost simple, not easy, but clear, and my phone buzzed again a few minutes later, a message from Michael confirming that the transaction had been formally recorded as invalid, and that any further action would now shift toward addressing how it had been initiated in the first place, and I read that carefully, because that second part mattered just as much as the first. The invalidation closed one part of the situation, but it opened another, one that focused on the process itself, the decisions that had been made, and the documentation that had been used, and I knew that part would unfold more slowly, more deliberately, but it would unfold, because once something enters that system, it does not simply disappear, it continues until every piece is accounted for. And I set my phone down again, looking out the window of the hospital room, the same view as the day before, the same parking lot, the same steady movement of people going about their lives, and I thought about how different everything felt now compared to just a few days earlier, not because anything had been reversed yet, but because the truth of the situation had been fully established, not privately, not emotionally, but in a way that could not be undone. And my phone buzzed again, and this time I knew who it was before I even looked, and when I opened the message, it was from my mother, shorter than any message she had sent before. "Emma, we need to talk," and I read it once, then set the phone down without responding, because I understood what that message meant now in a way I never had before. It was not about control, not about directing the conversation or reshaping the situation, it was about trying to return to a space where things could be handled between us, where tone and familiarity could soften what had already been defined, and that space no longer existed, not in the way it used to, because everything that mattered had already been placed into a structure that did not respond to those things. And I thought back to the way my father had said, "We do not need formal permission," and how absolute that had sounded at the time, how certain. And now, sitting here with a formal determination already recorded, that statement felt distant, almost disconnected from the reality we were in now. And I realized something that I had not fully allowed myself to see before. This was never just about the house, it was about the assumption that they could decide what belonged to me without ever needing to ask, that they could step in, take control, and define the outcome based on what they believed was right, and that assumption had carried through everything, every conversation, every decision, every moment where I was expected to adjust instead of object. And this was the first time that assumption had met something it could not override, something that did not bend, something that required proof instead of belief. And as I sat there in that quiet hospital room, I understood that what had shifted was not just the situation, it was the balance itself, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something much simpler and much more final, the presence of something they did not have and could not recreate, and that absence had been enough to change everything. 3 days later, I was discharged from the hospital, and the first place I went was not home, not yet, but the bank downtown where my safety deposit box was held, because there was one thing I needed to see with my own eyes, not because I doubted it was there, but because I wanted to feel the reality of it in my hands, and when the banker slid the small metal box across the table and stepped away, I opened it slowly, and there it was, exactly where I had left it, the original deed, thick paper. Official seal, my name printed clearly in a way that did not shift or bend depending on who looked at it, and I sat there for a moment, holding it, not with relief, not with triumph, just with a quiet understanding of what it represented, not just ownership of a house, but ownership of something much deeper, something I had built on my own, something that no one else had the right to redefine. And later that afternoon, I returned to the house on Ridgeview Drive, pulling into the driveway slowly, noticing how everything looked exactly the same front porch, the same windows, the same small details I had chosen myself. And I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, taking a breath that felt different from any breath I had taken there before, because this time, I was not arriving as someone trying to prove I belonged, I was arriving as someone who already knew. And when I walked inside, the house was quiet, unchanged, untouched by everything that had happened outside of it, and I set my bag down on the kitchen counter, running my hand lightly across the surface the way I had the first time I saw it, and I realized something simple but powerful: nothing about this place had changed. The only thing that had changed was how clearly everything around it had been revealed, and my phone buzzed again, and I knew without looking who it was, and when I finally opened the message, it was from my father this time, not my mother, not Daniel, just him, and it was shorter than anything he had ever sent me before. "We made a mistake," and I read it once, then again, not searching for anything hidden inside it, because there was nothing hidden, just a statement, plain and direct, and for a moment I thought about responding, about saying something that acknowledged it, something that explained what that mistake had cost, not just in terms of the house, but in terms of everything that had led to that moment, all the years of being overlooked, dismissed, expected to adjust. But I did not type anything, I just locked my phone and set it down, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. Not every realization requires a response, not every truth needs to be explained back to the people who finally see it, and I walked through the house slowly, room by room, not checking, not inspecting, just being there, letting the quiet settle in around me, and for the first time, it felt like it belonged to me in a way that went beyond paperwork or ownership. It felt like it reflected something that had been tested and did not break, something that held its shape even when everything around it tried to shift. And as the evening light came through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, I sat down in the living room and let that feeling settle completely, because this was not a victory in the way people usually think of it. There was no moment of confrontation, no dramatic ending, just a quiet shift, a line that had been drawn not through words, but through something much more solid. And as I sat there, I realized that the meaning of everything that had happened was not just about a house or a document or a transaction that failed. It was about something much more human, something that exists in every relationship whether we recognize it or not, the difference between care and control, between helping and deciding for someone else, between being part of someone's life and trying to define it for them. And I understood that what had been broken here was not just trust, it was the assumption that love gave someone the right to take, to override, to act without asking. And what had been restored was not just ownership of a property, but ownership of myself, of my decisions, of my place in my own life. And maybe the hardest part of that realization was accepting that people who believe they are doing the right thing can still cause harm when they stop listening, when they stop asking, when they assume that their perspective is enough to justify their actions. And if there is anything this experience taught me, it is that respect is not something that should ever be implied. It has to be practiced consistently, even in moments when it feels inconvenient or unnecessary, because the absence of it, even for a short time, can change everything. And at the same time, it showed me that strength does not always look like confrontation or resistance. Sometimes it looks like staying still, letting the truth stand on its own, allowing systems, facts, and boundaries to speak where emotions once dominated. And in doing that, something shifts, not just in the situation, but in the way people see each other. And maybe that is where the real meaning lives, not in proving someone wrong, but in creating a moment where everyone involved is forced to see clearly, to understand the impact of their choices, and to recognize that real connection is built not on control, but on respect, on listening, and on the willingness to see someone else not as an extension of yourself, but as a person with a life that belongs entirely to them.